My son's teacher is sleeping with my lover and she's threatening to expose us. I was running late for parent-teacher conferences when Mrs. Hendricks cornered me. I understand your trust issues after what Leland did with the offshore accounts. But Jaden is adjusting well despite everything. I froze in the classroom doorway. My ex-husband's gambling debt and the hidden bank accounts were sealed in our divorce records. How could my son's new third-grade teacher possibly know? I'm sorry, what did you just say? She smiled warmly, organizing papers on her desk. Just that children are resilient, even after parents lose life savings to addiction. I never told you about any of that. Oh, you must have mentioned it at orientation. But I hadn't attended orientation. I'd been in depositions that day, still fighting Leland for child support. Throughout the 20-minute conference, she dropped more bombs. She knew about my miscarriage between Jaden and what would have been his sister. She referenced my mother's Alzheimer's diagnosis, which I'd told no one at school. She even mentioned the exact words Leland had used when he'd asked for the divorce. Jaden talks quite a bit, she explained when I questioned her. Children tell teachers everything. But Jaden didn't know these things. I'd shielded him from the worst of the divorce. I studied Mrs. Hendricks more carefully. Mid-20s, auburn hair, pretty in an effortless way. She'd started 3 months ago, replacing Mrs. Garcia, who'd mysteriously taken early retirement. Something about her smile seemed familiar but wrong, like a word mispronounced. Has Leland been in contact with the school? I asked carefully. Parents aren't supposed to discuss each other during conferences, she said, but her eyes glinted. Though I understand why you'd be concerned, given the restraining order. The restraining order was temporary and had expired. Only 3 people knew it had ever existed. Me, Leland, and our lawyers. My hands started shaking. That night, I called my lawyer. She confirmed no school officials had requested records. The information was sealed and would require a court order to access. I dug through social media, searching for anything about Mrs. Hendricks. Her Facebook was sparse, created just 4 months ago. No history before her hiring at Jaden's school. But in one photo, I saw it. A reflection in her sunglasses. A man taking the picture. The shape of his shoulders. The watch on his wrist. I'd bought that watch for Leland's birthday 5 years ago. I drove back to school the next morning, demanding answers from the principal. Mrs. Hendricks came highly recommended, Principal Davies assured me. Excellent references from her previous school in Oregon. Did you verify those references? Of course. She's been wonderful with the children. Jaden especially seems to love her. That made my stomach turn. Jaden had been coming home with stories about his amazing teacher. How she knew his favorite foods, his favorite games, understood him better than anyone. Now I realized why. She'd been coached by his father. I hired a private investigator. Within a week, he had answers that confirmed my worst fears. Kenzie Hendricks was her real name, but she'd never taught in Oregon. She'd been a bartender in Atlantic City until 6 months ago. That's where she'd met Leland during one of his gambling binges. The investigator had photos. Leland and Kenzie at casinos, restaurants, hotels. The timeline was damning. They'd been together for a year, while we were still married, while I was trying to save our family. Now she was playing teacher to get access to our son. There's more, the investigator said. She's been documenting everything. Photos of Jaden, recordings of conversations, detailed notes about your routines. She texts Leland updates throughout the day. That's insane. Why would they do this? Your ex is building a custody case. He needs evidence that Jaden would be better off with him. What better witness than a teacher? I felt sick. I went to the police but was told no crime had been committed. She was a real teacher with real credentials, just obtained recently. Dating a student's father wasn't illegal. The school said without proof of inappropriate behavior with Jaden, their hands were tied. So I played my own game. I started documenting everything. Recording pickups and drop-offs, saving every communication. I even put a recorder in Jaden's backpack, which revealed Kenzie asking probing questions about our home life. The custody petition arrived 2 weeks later. Leland was seeking full custody, citing concerns about my mental health and stability. His star witness? Jaden's teacher, who'd observed troubling behavior and parental inadequacies. The hearing was set for next month. Kenzie would testify about my erratic conference behavior and paranoid accusations. Leland would paint me as unstable, seeing conspiracies where there was just a dedicated teacher. But yesterday, something changed. Kenzie pulled me aside at pickup, her mask finally slipping. You should stop digging into my past, she said quietly. Leland isn't the only one I've done this for. And the last mother who tried to fight back, well, her son doesn't go to this school anymore. I stand frozen right there at the pickup line, my heart beating so hard I can feel it in my throat. Other parents brush past me collecting their kids, but I can't move. Kenzie's words keep playing in my head like a broken record. The last mother who tried to fight back. Her son doesn't go to this school anymore. I force my legs to work and walk to Jaden's classroom, plastering on a smile that feels like it might crack my face. He bounces over with his backpack, chattering about something that happened at recess, and I nod and make the right sounds while my hands shake. I take his hand and walk quickly toward the parking lot, scanning for Kenzie even though I know she's still inside. I need to call my attorney right now, but first I need to get my son somewhere safe. I buckle Jaden into his booster seat and start driving. No destination in mind, just away from that school. My phone buzzes in the cup holder, but I ignore it until we pull into a grocery store parking lot 15 minutes later. I hand Jaden my phone so he can play his game and tell him I need to make a quick call. I dial my attorney's number with trembling fingers, praying she picks up. She answers on the second ring, and I pour out everything that just happened, trying to keep my voice steady so Jaden doesn't hear the panic. My attorney listens without interrupting as I repeat Kenzie's exact words about the last mother whose son doesn't go to the school anymore. When I finish, she's quiet for a moment, then tells me this might actually help our case because it shows witness intimidation. She asks if anyone else heard the conversation, and my stomach sinks when I realize we were alone near the side door, away from other parents. She tells me to write down every single detail tonight while it's fresh in my memory, everything from what Kenzie was wearing to her exact tone of voice. We talk about whether this counts as a real threat or just intimidation, and she promises to research similar cases where teachers use their positions like this. She asks if I feel safe going home, and I tell her yes. Kenzie doesn't know where we live. Before we hang up, she reminds me to save copies of everything in multiple places, and to document any other contact. I sit in the car after the call ends, watching Jaden play on my phone, and realize my whole body is shaking. That night, after Jaden goes to bed, I sit at my kitchen table with my laptop and start typing. My hands still tremble as I write out every detail of the pickup conversation, forcing myself to remember exactly how Kenzie looked when she said those words. I describe her smile, the way she glanced around to make sure no other parents were nearby, the casual tone she used like she was discussing the weather. I write about how she positioned herself between me and my car, blocking my path just enough to make me uncomfortable. I note the time, the location, what she was wearing, everything I can remember. 2 hours pass, and I have 3 pages of single-space notes covering every aspect of that 5-minute conversation. I read through it twice, making sure I didn't exaggerate or add anything that didn't happen. Then I email it to my attorney with a timestamp in the subject line. I save copies to my laptop, my phone, and a thumb drive that I hide in my bedroom. It's past midnight when I finally close my laptop, but I know I won't sleep anyway. The next morning, I call the school attendance line and report that Jaden has a stomach bug. It's not completely a lie because my anxiety has been making him anxious too, and he woke up this morning asking if he has to see Miss Hendricks today. I tell him he gets a day off and watch his whole body relax. While he watches cartoons, I call my attorney and ask if she can meet me today. She clears her afternoon schedule and I spend the morning printing out everything. The private investigator's reports with all the photos from Atlantic City. The timeline showing when Kenzie and Leland started dating. The recordings from Jaden's backpack where Kenzie asks him inappropriate questions. The custody petition Leland filed. Everything goes into a thick folder that I carry to my attorney's office like it contains gold. She spreads it all across her conference table, and we go through each piece systematically. She explains that Kenzie's threat might actually help us because it shows her true character, but we need to be strategic about when we introduce it. If we show our hand too early, they'll have time to prepare a defense. She suggests we let them think we're just a paranoid mother right up until the hearing, then hit them with everything at once. My attorney gets to work immediately on an emergency motion. She types while I sit across from her, explaining what she's including. The motion requests a protective order to prevent Kenzie from having any contact with Jaden outside of unavoidable classroom time. She attaches my sworn statement about yesterday's threat, all the private investigator's evidence about Kenzie's relationship with Leland, and a detailed explanation of why I'm concerned about her access to my son. She includes the recordings of Kenzie asking Jaden personal questions, despite having no educational reason to do so. The motion requests an expedited hearing because of the immediate threat to my son's well-being. She prints 3 copies, one for the court, one for Leland's attorney, and one for our files. We walk to the courthouse together and she files it at the family court clerk's window. The clerk stamps it and tells us a judge will review it within 24 hours for the emergency order. Walking back to my car, I feel like I can breathe a little easier, knowing we're taking action instead of just waiting for them to make the next move. While we wait for the court's response, I decide I can't just sit around doing nothing. I call the school district's central office and ask to speak to someone about filing a formal complaint. The receptionist transfers me to the superintendent's office where an administrative assistant answers. I explain that I need to file a complaint about a teacher at my son's school, and she asks me to hold. When she comes back, she sounds more serious and asks me to explain the situation. I tell her about Kenzie's undisclosed relationship with my ex-husband, the threat she made yesterday, and my concern that she might have done this to other families. The assistant goes quiet for a moment, then tells me this is very serious, and someone will contact me within 24 hours. She takes down all my information and asks me to email her any documentation I have. I send her a carefully edited version of what I sent my attorney, leaving out some of the more personal details but including enough to show the pattern. Principal Davies has been useless, so I'm going over his head to people who might actually care about protecting students. My phone rings that afternoon, and I nearly drop it when I see it's the private investigator. He tells me he found something that made him call immediately instead of waiting for our weekly update. He's been digging deeper into Kenzie's background and found evidence that she did this before in New Jersey. She befriended a divorced father there and got hired at his daughter's school under a slightly different name, using Mackenzie instead of Kenzie on her application. That case ended with the mother losing custody and moving away, which explains why Kenzie was so confident when she threatened me yesterday. The investigator found court documents online and is sending them to me right now. He says the New Jersey mother never discovered Kenzie's relationship with her ex until after she'd already lost custody. By then, it was too late to appeal. I thank him and hang up, then immediately open my email to see the documents he sent. Reading through them makes me feel sick. The pattern is identical. Kenzie testified about the mother's parenting inadequacies. The father's lawyer used her testimony as evidence. The mother tried to fight back but had no proof of the conspiracy. I forward everything to my attorney within minutes. My attorney calls me back within an hour, her voice tight with controlled anger. She's already reaching out to law enforcement in New Jersey to request records from that case. She explains that this pattern of behavior changes everything because it shows Kenzie has done this systematically, not just once. If we can prove she's made a practice of infiltrating schools to help fathers win custody cases, it stops being a personal vendetta and starts looking criminal. She tells me this might interest prosecutors because it shows fraud, possibly conspiracy, and definitely abuse of her position as a teacher. She's going to contact the New Jersey mother's attorney to see if they're willing to provide statements. This could strengthen our case significantly, maybe even get Kenzie arrested before our custody hearing. I feel a surge of hope mixed with rage that Kenzie has been getting away with this, destroying families and traumatizing children for who knows how long. My attorney reminds me not to contact Kenzie or Leland directly, no matter how angry I am, because anything I do could be used against me in court. 2 days crawl by with no word from the court about our emergency motion. I keep Jaden home from the school both days, telling the attendance office he's still sick. He's actually doing better away from the school, sleeping through the night and seeming less anxious. On the third day, the district's HR investigator finally calls. She introduces herself professionally and asks to schedule an interview about my complaint. Her tone is polite but skeptical, like she's used to dealing with angry parents who make accusations. She asks why I waited until now to raise concerns about Miss Hendricks if the relationship with my ex has been going on for so long. I explain the timeline carefully, emphasizing that I only discovered the full extent of the deception after hiring a private investigator to look into some concerning behavior. I tell her about the sealed divorce records Kenzie somehow knew about, the inappropriate questions she asked Jaden, and finally the threat she made at pickup. The investigator's tone shifts slightly as I talk, becoming more serious. She schedules an interview for next week and asks me to bring any documentation I have. I agree, and make a note to ask my attorney what I should and shouldn't share with the district. The court order arrives by email that afternoon, and I nearly cry reading it. The family court has granted a temporary order limiting Kenzie's contact with Jaden to necessary classroom interactions only. The order explicitly states she cannot speak to him privately, cannot ask him personal questions, and must maintain professional boundaries at all times. The judge scheduled a full hearing in 2 weeks to address the broader custody issues and Kenzie's involvement in the case. I print out 3 copies of the order, one for me, one for the school, and one for my attorney. Reading through it again, I feel a small measure of relief even though I know Kenzie will find ways around it. She's smart, and she's been doing this long enough to know how to work the system. But at least now there's an official court document saying she can't have unlimited access to my son. I call my attorney to thank her, and she reminds me that this is just the first step. The real battle happens at the hearing in 2 weeks, and we need to be prepared for Kenzie and Leland to come at us hard. She tells me to start thinking about what I want to say on the stand, and to practice staying calm under pressure. I hang up and look at the calendar, counting down the days until I can finally tell a judge everything that's been happening. The next morning, I print 3 copies of the court order on crisp white paper that feels official and important in my hands. I drive to the school during my lunch break, my stomach tight with nerves about confronting Principal Davies face-to-face after weeks of his dismissive responses. The secretary waves me back to his office, where he sits behind his desk looking at his computer screen, and when I hand him the court order, he takes it with a confused expression that shifts as he reads. His face goes pale around the 3rd paragraph, where the judge explicitly names the school's responsibility to enforce the no-contact provisions. He sets the paper down carefully and looks up at me with actual discomfort in his eyes for the first time since this whole nightmare started. He clears his throat and promises to monitor the classroom situation personally, then suggests I might want to consider transferring Jaden to a different 3rd grade class to make things easier for everyone. The suggestion makes my jaw clench because it feels like asking me to uproot my son again to solve a problem the school let happen in the first place. I tell him Jaden stays in his current class with the substitute teacher who replaced Kenzie, and he nods quickly, clearly wanting this meeting to end. Walking back to my car, I feel a small spark of satisfaction at finally seeing him squirm, but it fades fast because none of this fixes what already happened to my son. That afternoon, I take a half day off work to meet the HR investigator at the district office, a bland building with fluorescent lights that make everything look washed out and tired. My attorney arrives right on time even though the investigator had suggested her presence wasn't necessary, which immediately made both of us suspicious about what kind of interview this would be. The investigator is a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain who introduces herself with a firm handshake and leads us to a small conference room. She starts with basic questions about when I first noticed concerns about Miss Hendricks, and I can hear the skepticism in her voice like she's dealt with angry parents making wild accusations before. My attorney nods at me to proceed, So I walk through the entire timeline, starting with the parent-teacher conference where Kenzie revealed sealed divorce information. I show the investigator my documentation, the private investigator's report with photos, the recordings from Jaden's backpack, the financial records showing payments from Leland to Kenzie. Her expression shifts as I lay out each piece of evidence, her professional mask cracking to show genuine concern. She takes copies of everything, her hands moving faster as she realizes this isn't a paranoid parent but a systematic scheme. When I finish, she sits back in her chair and promises a thorough investigation, though she reminds me she can't discuss personnel matters or potential outcomes with me directly. My attorney asks pointed questions about the timeline for the investigation and what protections exist for Jaden during the process. The investigator's answers are careful and bureaucratic, but I can see she's taking this seriously now, and that has to be enough for today. 2 days later, the private investigator calls while I'm making dinner, and I step out onto the back porch so Jaden won't overhear. He's found more details about the New Jersey case, his voice grim as he walks me through what he discovered in court documents he pulled from public records. Kenzie testified against that mother using almost identical tactics, claiming to have observed concerning parental behaviors and making detailed notes about the child's well-being. The mother's attorney never discovered Kenzie's relationship with the father until after custody was already transferred, and by then the appeal window had closed. My stomach turns thinking about how close I came to the same fate, how easily I could have lost Jaden if I hadn't trusted my instincts that something was wrong. The investigator emails me copies of the court transcripts that night, and I read through them with my hands shaking, seeing my own nightmare reflected in another woman's legal battle. The testimony is chilling because it sounds so professional and caring, exactly the way Kenzie would have testified against me if we hadn't caught her first. My attorney moves fast with the new information, tracking down the New Jersey mother through her old lawyer who's willing to make the connection. It takes 3 days of phone tag before we finally connect, and when the woman's voice comes through my speaker, it sounds tired and broken in a way that makes my chest hurt. She agrees immediately to provide a sworn statement about her experience with Kenzie, describing the same pattern of inappropriate knowledge and coached testimony that I witnessed. Her voice cracks when she talks about the veiled threats Kenzie made when she tried to fight back, how the teacher warned her that pushing too hard would only make things worse for her daughter. The worst part comes at the end of our call when she tells me she hasn't seen her daughter in over a year because her ex-husband moved out of state right after winning custody. I can hear her crying softly, and I don't know what to say, except thank you for being brave enough to help me fight back. After we hang up, I sit in my car in the work parking lot and let myself cry too, grateful that I caught this before it was too late, but heartbroken for this other mother who didn't. The hearing date looms closer, and I start falling apart at work in small ways that add up to obvious problems. I make mistakes on simple spreadsheets that I've done hundreds of times, transposing numbers and forgetting to save files before closing them. When colleagues ask if I'm okay, I snap at them with sharp responses that I regret immediately, my patience worn down to nothing by the constant stress. My boss finally pulls me aside after I nearly bite someone's head off in a team meeting, her expression concerned rather than angry as she closes her office door. I break down explaining the custody situation in broad terms without revealing all the disturbing details, and she listens quietly while I ugly cry into the tissue box she pushes across her desk. Her support surprises me because I expected lectures about professionalism and keeping personal life separate from work. Instead, she offers to adjust my schedule around court dates and tells me to take whatever time I need, which makes me cry harder because kindness feels overwhelming when I'm barely holding it together. She walks me to my car afterward and reminds me that my job will be here when this is over, and I drive home feeling slightly less alone in this fight. Jaden's anxiety manifests in nightmares that wake both of us multiple times each week, his small voice calling out in the dark that his teacher is asking him questions he doesn't know how to answer. I hold him in his bed while he cries against my shoulder, his body shaking with sobs that feel too big for an 8-year-old to carry. I promise him things will get better soon while feeling like a liar because I can't guarantee anything until the judge makes his ruling. The nightmares leave dark circles under his eyes that make him look older and sadder than any child should look. The next morning, I email his therapist requesting an emergency session to address the getting worse anxiety, explaining that the court hearing is approaching and the stress is affecting his sleep. She responds within an hour, offering an appointment that same afternoon, and I pick Jaden up early from the school to take him. The therapist meets with both of us together in her office filled with toys and art supplies that usually make Jaden relax. She uses play therapy techniques with puppets and dolls, asking Jaden to show her what happens at the school with Miss Hendricks using the toys instead of words. Through careful questioning that feels casual but is clearly strategic, she discovers that Kenzie has been asking him about my work schedule during regular classroom time. She phrases it as caring questions about whether mom is tired or busy, but Jaden demonstrates how she asks who visits our house and whether I seem sad or angry lately. Despite the court order explicitly limiting her contact to necessary classroom interactions, she's finding ways to gather information through seemingly innocent conversation that no one would flag as inappropriate. The therapist's expression tightens as Jaden acts out these scenes with the puppets, and she makes careful notes on her pad. After the session, she pulls me aside to say she'll be documenting everything for the court and recommending that Kenzie have zero contact with Jaden, even in a classroom setting. I start documenting each instance Jaden reports when I pick him up from the school, writing detailed notes in a composition book that's filling up fast with disturbing patterns. Every evening, I send emails to Principal Davies with copies to the district HR investigator, describing exactly what Jaden told me and when the interactions occurred. The principal's responses get shorter and more terse with each email, shifting from promises to monitor the situation to brief acknowledgments that he received my message. Nothing actually changes at the school despite the court order and his promises, and I watch my son's anxiety increase daily, while the adults who should protect him do nothing effective. My attorney advises patience while we build our evidence file for the hearing, reminding me that documentation is power in family court. Every day feels like letting my son be used as a pawn in a game where the rules keep changing, and I hate that patience is the best strategy when my instincts scream to pull him out of school entirely. 3 days before the hearing, Leland's attorney contacts mine requesting a settlement conference to avoid going to court. They propose a shared custody arrangement where Leland gets weekends and all school breaks, with Kenzie agreeing to transfer to a different school to eliminate the conflict of interest. My attorney presents this as a possible compromise that would spare everyone the stress and expense of a trial, her voice carefully neutral as she outlines the terms. I refuse immediately without even pretending to consider it, because accepting would reward their manipulation and give Leland exactly what he wanted from this scheme. The settlement would erase accountability for what they did and let Kenzie walk away to potentially do this to another family somewhere else. My attorney doesn't argue with my decision, just says she needed to present the offer as required by professional ethics, and I can hear the approval in her voice even though she can't say it directly. That night, I lie awake staring at my ceiling and second-guessing my decision to reject the settlement offer. Maybe I'm being stubborn and prideful, risking everything on a trial when I could guarantee keeping some custody right now. My mind spins through worst-case scenarios where the judge doesn't believe my evidence or thinks I'm overreacting to a teacher dating my ex. By 4 in the morning, I've convinced myself I made a terrible mistake, and I'm reaching for my phone to call my attorney when it rings first. She's calling to say she supports my choice and believes we have a strong case, but she's required by law to present all settlement offers, even ones she thinks I should reject. She reminds me that going to court is always a risk because judges are unpredictable, but the evidence of Kenzie's pattern behavior across 2 states and the threat she made gives us powerful ammunition. Her confidence steadies me enough to get through the rest of the day, counting down the hours until I can finally tell a judge everything and hope he sees the truth in what we've documented. The investigator showed up at my door 2 days before the hearing carrying a binder so thick I could barely lift it when he handed it over. He spread the contents across my kitchen table and walked me through everything with careful precision, pointing out photos of Leland and Kenzie at casino tables, restaurant receipts with both their names, phone logs showing hundreds of calls between them over the past year. The financial records hit hardest because they showed wire transfers from Leland's account to Kenzie's totaling over $15,000, all carefully documented with dates, and amounts that lined up perfectly with when she got her teaching certificate and when she applied to work at Jaden's school. The investigator tapped the bank statements with his pen and explained that this transformed everything from a messy relationship into actual conspiracy, that these payments proved she was compensated to infiltrate my son's classroom and build a custody case. The statement from the other mother in New Jersey sat in a clear plastic sleeve, her words describing the exact same pattern Kenzie had used before, and I read it 3 times trying to process that this woman had done this to multiple families. My attorney arrived that evening, and we sat at my dining room table for 4 hours, going through every piece of evidence, organizing it into categories, and practicing how I would explain each discovery without sounding paranoid or vindictive. She made me rehearse answering hostile questions about why I hired a private investigator, why I put a recorder in Jaden's backpack, why I documented every interaction with such detail. We practiced my responses over and over until I could say calmly that everything I did was to protect my son, and that every concern I had turned out to be justified by the evidence. She warned me that Leland's lawyer would try to twist my protective actions into proof of instability, that he would paint me as a jealous ex-wife making up stories about a dedicated teacher. I kept my hands steady on the table and promised I could handle whatever they threw at me, but inside I felt like I might throw up from the pressure. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing between confidence in our evidence and terror about what would happen if the judge didn't believe me. I got up at 4 in the morning and went through my notes again, reading the investigator's report until the words blurred together. I forced myself to eat toast even though my stomach felt twisted, then stood in front of my closet trying to decide what professional outfit would make me look stable and responsible. My hands shook so badly while buttoning my blouse that I had to start over twice, and I cried while putting on makeup, which meant I had to wash my face and redo everything. Walking into the courthouse felt like moving through a dream where nothing seemed quite real, like I was watching myself from somewhere outside my body. My attorney met me at the entrance looking calm and put together, which helped me take a deep breath and focus on what we needed to do. We found an empty conference room and reviewed our strategy one more time, going over the order of evidence and the key points she would emphasize during cross-examination. She reminded me to breathe slowly during testimony, to take my time answering questions, to look at the judge when I spoke instead of at Leland or Kenzie. The bailiff called our case and we walked into the courtroom where Leland sat with his attorney at the opposite table, both of them looking confident and prepared. The hearing started with Leland's attorney standing up and painting a picture of me as an unstable woman who had harassed a dedicated teacher out of jealousy and spite. He described my decision to hire a private investigator as evidence of paranoid behavior, suggesting that my detailed documentation of every interaction showed I was unable to think rationally or co-parent effectively. I gripped my attorney's arm under the table and forced myself to keep my face neutral, to not react visibly even though every word felt like a knife. Leland took the stand next and performed beautifully, his voice full of concern as he described incidents he had twisted to make me sound crazy and erratic. He claimed I had been turning Jaden against him, that our son seemed anxious and upset whenever they talked about me during their visits. My attorney scribbled notes fast, preparing her cross-examination while I sat there struggling to keep my expression blank. When Kenzie took the stand, she looked poised and professional in a navy dress, describing her observations of Jaden with what seemed like genuine concern for his well-being. She testified that I had been hostile and accusatory since the parent-teacher conference, making wild allegations that disrupted Jaden's education and made him uncomfortable at the school. She denied having any inappropriate relationship with Leland, claiming they were just friends who had met recently through mutual people they both knew. My attorney stood up for cross-examination and started gently, asking basic timeline questions about when Kenzie started teaching and when she first met Leland. Kenzie answered confidently, sticking to her story about meeting him just a few months ago, until my attorney pulled out the photos from Atlantic City showing them together a full year earlier. The color drained from Kenzie's face as she realized we had proof she had just lied under oath, that she had committed perjury right there in front of the judge. The questioning got more intense as my attorney walked Kenzie through the financial records, pointing out each wire transfer from Leland and asking what the money was for. Kenzie stumbled badly trying to explain, first claiming they were loans, then saying they were gifts, then finally admitting she couldn't remember what any of the payments were supposed to be for. The judge leaned forward in his chair, paying close attention as Kenzie's credibility fell apart in front of everyone. My attorney introduced the evidence from the New Jersey case next, including the sworn statement from the other mother describing the identical pattern of behavior. Kenzie's attorney kept objecting, trying to keep the evidence out, but the judge allowed it as relevant to witness credibility and pattern of conduct. Kenzie's hands shook as she tried to insist that the situations were completely different, that she had never done anything like this before, but her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. My attorney shifted her papers and looked directly at Kenzie with a calm expression that somehow felt more dangerous than anger. She asked about the conversation at pickup when Kenzie pulled me aside, and I watched Kenzie's face carefully as she processed the question. Kenzie shook her head and said she never made any threats, that I must have misunderstood a friendly comment about how hard custody situations can be on families. Her voice sounded steady, but I noticed her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. My attorney pulled out a document from her folder and asked the judge for permission to approach, then handed copies to both Kenzie and the opposing counsel. It was my written account from that same evening, typed up with timestamps and exact quotes, describing Kenzie's words about the last mother whose son didn't go to the school anymore. My attorney read portions aloud, emphasizing the specific language Kenzie had used and the threatening tone. The judge leaned forward in his chair and asked Kenzie directly if she had ever discussed other mothers or other students with me during our interactions. Kenzie opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out for several seconds. And when she finally said no, the hesitation was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. My attorney let the silence hang there for a moment before moving to her final question. She asked Kenzie if she had ever used her position as a teacher to gather information for someone else, to document a child's home life for purposes unrelated to education. Kenzie's attorney jumped up immediately and objected, claiming the question was improper and outside the scope of the custody matter. The judge considered this for a moment but allowed the question as relevant to witness credibility and potential bias. Kenzie sat completely still in the witness chair, staring at my attorney without speaking, unable to come up with any response that wouldn't make things worse. The silence stretched out uncomfortably until the judge asked if she needed the question repeated. Kenzie finally said she didn't understand what was asked, which is a stalling tactic. My attorney rephrased it more directly, asking if Kenzie had ever taken notes about Jaden's home life and sent those notes to his father. Kenzie's attorney objected again, but the damage was already done, as everyone watched Kenzie struggle to find words. The judge called a 15-minute recess to give everyone a break from the tension, and my attorney reached under the table and squeezed my hand quickly. She leaned close and whispered that we were doing well, that Kenzie's credibility was destroyed, and the judge could see through everything now. I felt some of the tightness in my chest ease up as we stood for the recess, watching Kenzie hurry out of the courtroom looking shaken. After the recess ended and everyone returned to their seats, the judge asked my attorney to call her next witness. My attorney stood and said she was calling me to testify, and I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt surprisingly steady. The bailiff had me swear to tell the truth, and I sat down facing the courtroom with my hands folded in my lap. My attorney started with basic questions about my background and my relationship with Jaden, letting me establish the foundation before getting into the harder parts. She asked me to describe the parent-teacher conference that started everything, and I walked through it step by step. I explained how Kenzie had known about the offshore accounts and the sealed divorce records, information that should have been impossible for her to access. My attorney guided me through each piece of evidence, asking me to explain in my own words why each discovery had alarmed me. I described finding the photo with Leland's reflection, hiring the private investigator, and learning about Kenzie's real background in Atlantic City. My voice stayed calm and factual as I recounted the timeline, and I could see the judge taking notes while I spoke. I explained about the recordings from Jaden's backpack that captured Kenzie asking inappropriate questions about our home life. My attorney had me describe my attempts to get help from the school and the police, and how both had initially dismissed my concerns. I talked about the threat Kenzie made at pickup, how her mask had slipped when she warned me about the last mother who fought back. My attorney asked how that threat made me feel, and I said it terrified me because it confirmed this wasn't just about Leland wanting custody, it was a pattern of behavior Kenzie had used before. The cross-examination started with Leland's attorney standing up and approaching the witness stand with a skeptical expression. He suggested that I seemed very focused on my ex-husband's personal life, asking if I had trouble accepting that the marriage was over. I took a breath and answered that I had fully accepted the divorce, but I couldn't accept someone using my son to build a custody case through deception. He pressed harder, implying that I had become obsessed with Leland and fabricated this entire conspiracy theory because I was jealous of his new relationship. I felt my face get hot, but I kept my voice level and said I wished it were fabricated because the reality of someone infiltrating my son's school was terrifying for any parent. The judge nodded slightly, and I saw Leland's attorney realize his aggressive approach wasn't working the way he'd hoped. He tried a few more questions about why I hired a private investigator and whether that seemed like normal behavior, and I explained that normal people don't have their ex's girlfriend secretly working as their child's teacher. He asked if I had any proof that Kenzie had actually harmed Jaden, and I said the emotional harm was documented by his therapist and obvious in his nightmares and anxiety. Leland's attorney wrapped up his questions looking frustrated, and I stepped down from the witness stand feeling like I'd held my ground. My attorney called the private investigator next, and he took the stand carrying a thick folder of documentation. He stated his credentials and experience, then began walking through his findings in a dry, professional manner. He explained how he'd traced Kenzie's background starting with her social media presence and discovering the sparse history. He described finding the photos from Atlantic City that showed her with Leland at casinos and restaurants over a year ago, during my marriage. The investigator presented phone records showing frequent contact between Kenzie and Leland throughout the time she'd been teaching at Jaden's school. He detailed the financial transfers totaling over $15,000 from Leland to Kenzie during the past year. His testimony was purely factual, laying out dates and amounts and documentation without any emotional commentary. He explained his process for discovering the New Jersey case, including how he'd found court records and contacted the previous mother through her attorney. The investigator described patterns of behavior that matched exactly between the two situations. His calm, methodical presentation somehow made the evidence more powerful than any dramatic reveal could have been. Leland's attorney tried to challenge some of the financial evidence during cross-examination, but the investigator had documentation for everything and answered each question precisely. The guardian ad litem took the stand after the investigator finished, introducing herself and explaining her role in evaluating what custody arrangement would serve Jaden's best interests. She described interviewing Jaden multiple times and visiting both households to observe the environments. She noted that Jaden showed normal, age-appropriate attachment to both parents and seemed to love spending time with each of us. However, she said, Jaden displayed notable anxiety specifically related to the school and his teacher that went beyond normal childhood worries. She explained that during their conversations, Jaden had expressed confusion about why his teacher asked so many questions about home and seemed to know things he hadn't told her. The guardian ad litem stated that in her professional opinion, this anxiety stemmed directly from the inappropriate boundary violations by Kenzie. She recommended maintaining primary physical custody with me while allowing Leland to work on addressing his gambling issues through treatment. She strongly recommended that Kenzie have no further contact with Jaden whatsoever, stating that the relationship had become harmful to his emotional well-being. She noted that Leland's judgment in involving Kenzie in the custody dispute raised serious concerns about his ability to prioritize Jaden's needs over his own desires. Jaden's therapist testified next, carefully balancing her duty to protect his privacy with the need to provide relevant information to the court. She confirmed that she'd been working with Jaden for several months and had observed his symptoms worsen significantly after the school year started. She described his reports of nightmares where he was questioned and couldn't give the right answers. The therapist explained that Jaden had expressed fear that he was somehow in trouble, though he didn't understand what he'd done wrong. She testified that during play therapy sessions, Jaden had acted out scenarios of his teacher asking him questions that made him uncomfortable. The therapist avoided specific details due to confidentiality, but made clear that Jaden's anxiety centered around school and his interactions with Kenzie. She stated her professional opinion that minimizing contact with the source of his anxiety was critical for his continued healing. Her concern was evident in her voice, as she described how an 8-year-old child had been caught in the middle of adult manipulation. The hearing moved into closing arguments with my attorney standing to address the judge. She delivered a summary of all the evidence, walking through how it demonstrated calculated manipulation rather than genuine concern for Jaden's well-being. She emphasized that Leland and Kenzie had conspired together to use a position of trust and authority to build a custody case, traumatizing a child in the process. My attorney highlighted the financial payments, the pattern of behavior from New Jersey, and Kenzie's perjury on the stand today. She argued that Leland's judgment was fundamentally compromised by his ongoing gambling issues and his willingness to involve his girlfriend in such an inappropriate scheme. She asked the court to maintain primary custody with me, require supervised visitation for Leland until he completed treatment, and ensure that Kenzie had no contact with Jaden. Leland's attorney stood for his closing argument and tried to salvage the situation by suggesting that even if the court didn't believe Kenzie's testimony, there was still no evidence I was a better parent. He requested shared custody with equal time, claiming that Jaden needed both parents in his life. His argument felt weak after everything that had been presented, and I could see the judge wasn't buying it. The judge announced he needed a brief recess to review all the evidence before making his ruling. Those 20 minutes felt longer than the entire rest of the hearing combined. My attorney tried to prepare me for any outcome, reminding me that judges can be unpredictable, and we needed to be ready for anything. I could barely hear her words over the rushing sound in my ears and the pounding of my heart. I watched the clock on the courtroom wall tick forward impossibly slowly, while my mind raced through every possible scenario. My attorney's hand on my shoulder was the only thing keeping me grounded as we waited. Finally, the bailiff called us back into the courtroom and everyone took their seats. The judge's expression was serious and unreadable as he looked down at his notes. My hands gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. The judge began speaking, addressing Kenzie directly first. He stated that he had deep concerns about her testimony today and the substantial evidence of perjury presented by opposing counsel. He said he was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for investigation into possible criminal charges. The judge continued that he would also be notifying the state teaching certification board about the evidence presented regarding her conduct. Kenzie's face drained of all color as she realized the professional consequences she was facing, that her teaching career was likely over, regardless of what happened with any criminal charges. The judge turned his attention to Leland next, and I watched my ex-husband's face tighten as he realized he was about to face consequences too. The judge spoke directly to him, saying his judgment in involving his son's teacher in a custody dispute raised serious questions about his fitness to make decisions in the child's best interest. He pointed out that the evidence showed ongoing gambling issues and financial payments to Kenzie, which indicated Leland hadn't really addressed the problems that destroyed our marriage in the first place. Leland opened his mouth to protest, but his attorney grabbed his arm and squeezed hard enough that I could see his fingers pressing into the suit jacket. The judge wasn't finished, though, continuing that a father who would manipulate his son's educational environment for legal advantage had demonstrated deeply flawed priorities. I felt my heart pounding as I waited for the actual custody ruling, knowing this could go either way, despite everything we'd proven. The judge shuffled some papers on his desk, and those few seconds of silence felt longer than the entire rest of the hearing. Then he announced that primary physical custody would remain with me, and I felt like someone had just removed a weight that had been crushing my chest for months. Leland would get supervised visitation every other weekend until he completed a gambling treatment program and parenting classes, which meant someone would be watching to make sure he didn't try anything like this again. The judge ordered that Kenzie have absolutely no contact with my son, not at the school or anywhere else, and he directed the school district to make sure this order was followed. Tears started streaming down my face before I could stop them, and I didn't even care that everyone in the courtroom could see me crying. My attorney reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, and I squeezed back so hard I probably hurt her fingers. The relief flooding through my body made me feel shaky and weak, like I might fall over if I tried to stand up. The judge kept talking, ordering Leland to pay my attorney fees and the costs of the private investigator since I'd been forced to defend against what he called a manufactured custody case. That meant I'd get back at least some of the money this nightmare had cost me, though no amount could really make up for the stress and fear of the past few months. He set up strict rules for how Leland and I had to talk to each other from now on, requiring all contact to go through a court-monitored app so there'd be a record of everything. No more surprise confrontations or manipulative text messages, just documented communication about our son's needs and schedule. The judge also ordered both of us to continue therapy for our son and scheduled another hearing in 6 months to check on how everything was going. I wrote down the date with shaking hands, already planning to make sure I had perfect documentation of every single thing between now and then. When the judge finally dismissed us, I stood up on wobbly legs and had to grab the table edge to steady myself. My attorney gathered her papers quickly and guided me toward the exit with a hand on my elbow, probably worried I might actually collapse right there in the courtroom. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like I'd just finished running a marathon while carrying something heavy, triumphant, but completely drained of energy. The bright sunlight outside felt too intense after the fluorescent courtroom lights, and I had to squint against it while my attorney steered me toward a bench. She hugged me right there on the courthouse steps, which I knew was probably unprofessional, but I needed it so badly I didn't care. We stood there for a minute while I cried into her shoulder, finally letting out all the fear and tension I'd been holding in for months. She pulled back and reminded me that we still had work to do, monitoring the situation and making sure the school followed through on the no-contact order. But she also said we should celebrate this victory, because we'd won something really important today, and she was proud of how I'd handled everything. I thanked her about a dozen times, my voice still shaky from crying, and promised to stay in touch about the next steps. That evening, I drove to my mother's house to pick up my son, who'd been staying there during the hearing because I didn't want him anywhere near the courthouse. My mom met me at the door, and I could tell from her face that she'd been worried sick all day, probably imagining the worst possible outcomes. I told her we won, and she started crying too, hugging me hard before going to get my son from the backyard where he'd been playing. When he came running in, I knelt down and pulled him close, breathing in the little kid's smell of his hair, and feeling grateful I still got to do this every day. I explained in simple terms that the judge had decided he would keep living with me, and that his teacher wouldn't be teaching him anymore. His face scrunched up in confusion, and he asked if he was in trouble, which broke my heart because he'd been carrying worry about this whole situation without really understanding it. I held him even closer and promised that none of this was his fault, that the adults had made mistakes, and now the adults were fixing those mistakes. He seemed to accept this and asked if he could have a snack, which felt like the most normal, wonderful question in the world. The next day, I had to go meet with the principal to talk about how the court order would actually work at the school. I walked into his office feeling different from the last time I'd been there begging for help, more confident now that I had legal backing for everything I'd been saying. He was way more cooperative than before, explaining that Kenzie had been placed on administrative leave while the district did their investigation and prepared a criminal referral. A substitute teacher would take over the class for the rest of the school year, and he offered to move my son to a different third-grade classroom if I wanted. I thought about it for a minute, weighing whether changing classrooms would help or just disrupt his friendships and routine even more. I decided to keep him where he was with the substitute teacher rather than making him start over with new kids and a new room. The substitute was a retired teacher who came with really good recommendations, and she wanted to meet with me to discuss my son's needs and how to help him transition. We set up a meeting for the next day, and I left the principal's office feeling like maybe the school would actually protect my kid this time. The substitute teacher turned out to be exactly what we needed, a warm, grandmotherly woman who'd been teaching for 30 years before she retired. She listened carefully as I explained the situation in general terms, not giving her all the awful details but making sure she understood my son might need extra patience and reassurance. She promised to watch for signs of anxiety and keep communication open with me about how he was doing in class. Something about her genuine kindness made me feel like I could lower my guard just a tiny bit, though I knew it would take time before I really trusted any teacher again. Over the next week, I watched my son start to relax as he realized his old teacher really wasn't coming back. The nightmares that had been waking him up almost every night started happening less often, maybe once or twice instead of 5 times a week. He came home from the school actually smiling and talking about things he'd learned, showing me projects and worksheets with pride instead of anxiety. His therapist noticed the improvement too during their sessions, telling me he seemed lighter and more willing to talk about his feelings. She adjusted her approach to focus on rebuilding his sense of safety and teaching him that most adults are trustworthy, even though some aren't. A few weeks later, the district's HR investigation wrapped up with a report that acknowledged serious failures in their hiring process. They admitted they hadn't done proper background screening and had missed red flags that should have prevented Kenzie from being hired in the first place. The superintendent sent me a formal apology letter and outlined new policies they were putting in place district-wide to prevent conflicts of interest. It didn't undo what had happened to my son or give back the months of fear and stress, but it felt like someone was finally admitting the system had failed to protect him. I saved the letter and the new policies in my documentation file, just in case I ever needed proof that the district had recognized their mistakes. Then I got notice that the district attorney was pursuing criminal charges against Kenzie for lying under oath and possibly conspiracy to commit fraud. A prosecutor called me to discuss whether I'd be willing to testify if the case went to trial, explaining what that would involve and how long it might take. I said yes right away without even thinking about it, wanting to make sure Kenzie faced real consequences and couldn't do this to another family somewhere else. The prosecutor seemed pleased with my willingness to cooperate and said she'd be in touch as the case developed. I hung up feeling like maybe justice was actually going to happen, not just for me and my son, but for that other mother in New Jersey whose case had helped prove the pattern. The first notification from Leland came through the co-parenting app 3 days later, a short message stating he'd enrolled in the court-ordered gambling treatment program at a facility downtown. The message was stiff and formal, nothing like how he used to text me during our marriage, and I could tell his lawyer had probably reviewed it before he sent it. Over the next few weeks, more messages arrived with updates about group sessions and individual counseling, each one carefully worded to show compliance with the court order. I saved every notification in a folder on my phone, still documenting everything even though the immediate crisis had passed. His supervised visits with Jaden started the following Saturday at a family services center, where a trained observer sat in the room taking notes. Jaden came home excited but confused, telling me his dad seemed different, and kept asking him questions about school and his friends, instead of talking about himself. The supervisor called me after the third visit to report that Leland was making genuine efforts to connect appropriately, following all the guidelines about not discussing the custody case or asking inappropriate questions. I felt strange watching my son look forward to seeing his father, a mix of relief that Leland might actually be changing, and worry that I was letting my guard down too soon. Every time Jaden ran to get his backpack for a visit, I reminded myself that Leland being a better father was ultimately good for everyone, even if it meant sharing my son with someone who'd hurt us both so deeply. My phone rang one evening while I was making dinner, an unfamiliar area code I almost didn't answer. The woman on the other end introduced herself as the mother from New Jersey, her voice shaking as she thanked me for exposing Kenzie's pattern and giving her a chance to fight back. She explained that she'd filed a motion to revisit her custody arrangement based on the new evidence about Kenzie's testimony being part of a calculated scheme, and her lawyer thought they had a real shot at getting her daughter back. We talked for over an hour, trading details about our experiences, and finding comfort in speaking with someone who truly understood this specific nightmare. She told me I was brave for investigating and fighting back, but I just felt lucky that I'd caught the scheme before it destroyed my relationship with Jaden completely. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch, both of us needing someone who could understand the weird trauma of having your child's teacher turn out to be working against you. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table crying, partly from relief that I'd helped someone else, and partly from the weight of knowing how close I'd come to losing everything. 2 months passed with a routine that started feeling almost normal again. Then an official letter arrived from the State Teaching Certification Board, the return address making my stomach clench before I even opened it. The letter informed me that they'd suspended Kenzie's teaching license pending the outcome of the criminal case, and if she was convicted, the suspension would become a permanent revocation. I read the formal language 3 times, feeling a grim satisfaction spread through my chest, as I realized Kenzie wouldn't be able to use her position to hurt other families while pretending to care about children. The letter included information about how to check the status of the case online and contact information if I had questions or concerns. I filed it with all my other documentation, the folder now several inches thick with evidence of everything we'd been through. That night, I allowed myself a glass of wine and a moment to feel like maybe justice was actually working, even if it was slower and messier than I'd hoped. Jaden's therapist called the next week to suggest we start spacing out sessions, since he'd made such significant progress over the past few months. She explained that he was using healthy coping strategies for managing anxiety and showing much better understanding of boundaries and appropriate adult behavior. During what she said would be our final joint session, she taught Jaden some techniques for recognizing when he was getting anxious and how to calm himself down without needing an adult to intervene every time. She used puppets and drawings to help him understand that adults sometimes make bad choices that aren't his responsibility to fix or worry about. Near the end of the session, she turned to me and said I'd done everything right by trusting my instincts and protecting my son, which made tears stream down my face even though I tried to hold them back. Jaden hugged me in the waiting room afterward, asking why I was crying if the therapist said we did good. I explained that sometimes people cry when they're relieved and happy, not just when they're sad, and he seemed to accept that even though he looked a little confused. Walking to the car, I felt lighter than I had in months, like maybe we were actually going to be okay. The daily school routine gradually became something I didn't dread anymore. I stopped scanning the parking lot for Kenzie's car during pickup and drop-off, and my stomach stopped clenching every time I walked into the building for a school event. The substitute teacher sent home positive notes about Jaden's participation in class discussions and his improvement in reading comprehension. He started bringing home artwork that looked happy instead of the dark scribbles with heavy black lines he'd been producing earlier in the year. One piece showed our family as stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun, and I stuck it on the refrigerator where I could see it every morning. Small moments of normalcy felt like major victories. Like the afternoon he invited a friend over to play video games without asking me 10 times if it was really okay. I caught myself smiling at random moments during the day, realizing I wasn't constantly braced for the next crisis or threat. Life wasn't perfect, and I still had moments of anxiety, but they were becoming less frequent and less intense as the weeks passed. The 6-month review hearing arrived faster than I expected, and I sat in the same courtroom where everything had been decided before. The judge reviewed Leland's file carefully, asking questions about his completion of the gambling treatment program and parenting classes. Leland's counselor testified that he'd attended every session and actively participated in group discussions about his addiction and its impact on his family. The judge commended Leland's progress and noted the positive reports from the supervised visit supervisor about his appropriate interactions with Jaden. He modified the custody order to allow unsupervised visits every other weekend, with the possibility of expanding to overnight visits if things continued going well over the next few months. I felt my chest tighten with nervousness about loosening the supervision, worried that Leland might slip back into old patterns without someone watching. The guardian ad litem spoke up to support the change, explaining that Jaden needed to rebuild trust with his father and that the current evidence suggested Leland was committed to change. I nodded when the judge asked if I had any objections, knowing I had to trust the process, even though every protective instinct told me to fight against giving Leland more access. My attorney called a few days later with news about the criminal case against Kenzie. The district attorney had offered her a plea deal for reduced charges in exchange for her cooperation in investigating whether Leland could face charges for conspiracy. My attorney explained the details carefully, noting that this arrangement might mean Kenzie avoided jail time entirely, which made my hands shake with anger. The prosecutor believed they could build a stronger case against both of them, with Kenzie's testimony about how the scheme was planned and executed. I asked why Kenzie would get a deal when she'd deliberately traumatized my son and tried to destroy our family, and my attorney acknowledged it felt unfair, but emphasized that prosecutors make these decisions based on what they can prove in court. She asked if I could accept the deal, knowing it might result in a better outcome overall, even if it meant Kenzie got less punishment than she deserved. I sat on my couch staring at the wall for 10 minutes after we hung up, feeling angry and powerless, but ultimately recognizing that I just wanted this entire situation finished, so we could move forward with our lives. I called her back and said I'd agree to whatever the prosecutor thought was best, as long as it meant some kind of consequences for what they'd done. The child support situation came up next when Leland's attorney contacted mine through the co-parenting app about modifying payments. He explained that Leland's financial situation had changed significantly after paying for treatment programs and legal fees and requested a reduction in the monthly amount. My attorney responded firmly that any modification needed to maintain adequate support for Jaden's needs while acknowledging reasonable changes in circumstances. The negotiations went back and forth through the app for 2 weeks, with both lawyers trading proposals and counter-proposals about specific dollar amounts. I stayed out of the direct discussions but approved or rejected each offer my attorney presented, trying to be fair while protecting Jaden's financial security. We finally reached an agreement that reduced Leland's payments by 20%, but included provisions for him to cover specific expenses like school supplies and extracurricular activities. The negotiations felt tense but remained professional throughout, everyone following the court's order to conduct all communication through the monitored app rather than directly between us. As Jaden's third-grade year wound down, his class had an end-of-year celebration with the substitute teacher who'd become genuinely beloved by all the students. I watched from the back of the classroom as Jaden laughed and played games with his friends, looking like a normal 8-year-old instead of the anxious child who'd been having nightmares 6 months earlier. The substitute teacher had decorated the room with colorful streamers and organized activities that had all the kids excited and happy. She pulled me aside near the end of the party to say what a resilient and sweet kid Jaden was, noting how much progress he'd made since she'd taken over the class. I thanked her for creating a safe space for him to heal and learn, feeling grateful that not all teachers were like Kenzie. Driving home that afternoon, Jaden chattered about summer plans and asked if he could go to day camp with his best friend, sounding carefree in a way I hadn't heard since before the divorce started. Over the summer, I focused all my energy on rebuilding normal routines and creating positive memories with Jaden that had nothing to do with courts or lawyers or teachers. We took a road trip to visit my parents, spending a week swimming in their community pool and having barbecues in their backyard. Jaden loved showing his grandparents his improved reading skills and teaching them the new video game he'd mastered. We went to the community pool near our house twice a week, where Jaden made friends with other kids, and I actually relaxed in a lounge chair with a book instead of constantly watching for threats. We established movie nights at home every Friday, taking turns picking films and making popcorn together while snuggled under blankets on the couch. He asked occasional questions about why Miss Hendricks wasn't his teacher anymore, and I answered honestly but in age-appropriate terms, explaining that she'd made bad choices that broke important rules. I emphasized that adults had fixed the problem, and he was completely safe now, which seemed to satisfy his curiosity, without giving him information that would worry him. By mid-July, I realized we were both genuinely happy most days, the darkness of the custody battle fading into something we'd survived rather than something that defined us. In August, an envelope from my attorney arrived with the official notice about Kenzie's plea deal. I opened it standing in my kitchen while Jaden played video games in the living room, reading that she'd pleaded guilty to perjury and conspiracy to interfere with custody. 6 months in county jail, 5 years probation, teaching license permanently revoked. My hands shook holding the paper because part of me wanted her locked up for years after what she'd put us through. But my attorney had already explained that we'd achieved what mattered most. Kenzie couldn't teach anymore, couldn't access other families' children, couldn't weaponize her position against vulnerable parents fighting for their kids. I folded the notice and filed it away, then went to sit with Jaden on the couch, watching him laugh at his game and feeling grateful we'd made it to this moment. A week later, Leland messaged me through the co-parenting app about 4th grade supplies and schedules, his tone careful and almost formal. We went back and forth about backpack requirements and lunch account setup, the conversation staying focused on practical details until he added a final message that made me pause. He apologized for his role in everything that happened, admitting he'd let his desire to win custody override his judgment about what was actually best for Jaden. The apology felt awkward and incomplete, but I could tell he meant it, so I replied that I accepted it as a starting point for better co-parenting going forward. I didn't forgive him completely and probably never would, but I could work with him if he kept putting Jaden first instead of competing with me. The new school year started 3 weeks later at a different elementary school I'd spent months researching and visiting. Jaden's 4th grade teacher was a woman in her 50s with 20 years of experience and a warm but professional manner that immediately put me at ease. The school had clear policies about parent-teacher boundaries and conflict of interest disclosure that the principal walked me through during orientation. I met with Jaden's teacher privately before the first day to provide background without overwhelming her, explaining in general terms that we'd had issues at his previous school and he might need extra support adjusting. She listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions about his learning style and interests, never prying into details I didn't offer. She told me she'd keep an eye on him and maintain open communication, which felt like exactly the right level of support. Jaden walked into his new classroom that first morning holding my hand tightly, but by pickup time, he was chattering about the kids he'd met and the cool science project they'd be starting next week. Within 2 weeks, he'd made several friends and started asking for playdates. His enthusiasm about learning returning in a way I hadn't seen since before 3rd grade started. His anxiety dropped to normal kid levels, the kind of nerves about tests and presentations that every student experiences rather than the deep fear that had been waking him up at night. He slept through the night consistently, and his teacher sent home notes praising his kindness toward other students and his creative approach to assignments. I kept waiting for problems to surface, but they didn't, and gradually I started believing that maybe we really were past the worst of it. Around the same time, I found a support group for parents dealing with custody disputes and parental alienation, meeting every Thursday evening at a community center across town. The first session felt uncomfortable as I listened to other parents share stories that ranged from heartbreaking to enraging, but by the 3rd week I found myself opening up about what had happened with Kenzie and Leland. Sharing the experience out loud to people who understood helped me process anger and trauma I'd been carrying like weights in my chest. Other parents nodded as I talked, several coming up afterward to say they'd experienced similar manipulation tactics, even if the specific details differed. The group leader, a therapist who specialized in family law cases, encouraged me to think about how I might use my experience to help others facing similar situations. The idea planted itself in my mind and started growing, making me wonder if there was a way to turn this nightmare into something that could protect other families. At Jaden's 1-year therapy check-in, the therapist reviewed his progress and declared him ready to be discharged from regular treatment. She explained that his resilience and healthy coping skills were exactly what she hoped to see, noting that my quick action to protect him and get him help had prevented long-term damage. I felt tears building as she talked about how well he'd done, how he'd learned to express his feelings appropriately and manage anxiety in healthy ways. Walking out to the parking lot afterward, Jaden gave me a huge hug and said he was glad we were a team, which made me cry for real. I hugged him back and told him I was proud of how brave he'd been through everything, meaning every word. Leland and I gradually found a new rhythm in co-parenting over the following months, communicating respectfully through the app and making decisions based on what Jaden needed, rather than scoring points against each other. He'd maintained his sobriety from gambling and completed his treatment program, building a healthier relationship with our son that focused on actual connection instead of competing with me. I watched him interact with Jaden during pickups and drop-offs, seeing genuine effort to be present and engaged, rather than performative parenting designed to look good for court. I'd never trust him completely again and probably shouldn't, but I could see he was genuinely trying to be a better father, which was what Jaden deserved. The school district's parent advisory board reached out to me in October after the superintendent mentioned my case during a policy review meeting. They invited me to join the board and help advocate for stronger background screening policies and conflict of interest protections. I attended my first meeting nervous about reliving everything publicly, but the board members were respectful and focused on systemic changes, rather than gossip about my specific situation. The superintendent asked if I'd be willing to help develop training materials for teachers about appropriate boundaries with families, explaining that my perspective as a parent who'd experienced the consequences of policy gaps would be valuable. Turning my nightmare into something that might protect other children felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected, giving purpose to the pain we'd endured. One evening in November, Jaden and I were cooking dinner together, him stirring pasta while I chopped vegetables for salad. He looked up at me and said I was the best mom and he was glad he lived with me, the comment coming out of nowhere in that way kids have of expressing big feelings during ordinary moments. I put down my knife and hugged him tight, grateful that we'd made it through the darkness to this moment of simple happiness in our kitchen. Life wasn't perfect, and I still had moments of anxiety about what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts or if the judge had ruled differently. Sometimes I woke up at night thinking about other mothers who might not be as lucky, who might not have the resources to hire investigators or the support system to keep fighting. The custody battle and Kenzie's betrayal had taught me to trust my instincts and fight for my child no matter how crazy people tried to make me feel. And those lessons had made me stronger, even though I wished I'd never needed to learn them. We were safe, we were healing, and we were building a good life together, which was more than I'd dared to hope for during the worst days of the custody fight. Well, that's the dramatic finale, if you can call it that. If you're still here, I'm impressed, confused, and slightly concerned. Either way, you might as well subscribe. Clearly you're committed.